For a medic and an immunologist who spent most of his career studying 3 proteins, 2 on the surface of a virus and 1 on the surface of a cell, you've no idea what a daunting audience you are. I suppose if I've got anything to add to the discussions that you've already heard today, I'm going to be speaking from 2 perspectives. One is leading a university that's been having to rethink its direction in relationship to food security over the last 6 years, and beginning to underpin what strategic direction we would wish to take. The second is for my sins, because of my background in tropical medicine and infectious diseases, I suspect, I've been chairing the Research Advisory Board for DFID, that's UK AID, for the last 6 years. And again, trying to work out how relatively meagre resources can be targeted at those in the poorest countries of the world, as well as the UK's responses to these development goals and directions, is something that does colour perspectives quite critically. But let me start with the university. Unashamedly, I'm going to talk about the one I know best, that's Cambridge. It is one of the world-leading universities, but it, alongside many universities, took decisions in the 1980s that really plant biology, plant breeding, agricultural sciences, well, they were a bit passé. When I was at Imperial College in 2000, I actually closed the Department of Agricultural Sciences. Why? We had 3 applicants and 15 lecturers. The whole community of students had lost the perspective that this was a really important direction and they were voting with their feet. Today, not the case. And that's why a rethink was really necessary. Now, both in my role as Vice-Chancellor, but also in my role as DFID, I'm going to make an outrageous statement. And that is, I am fed up of receiving report after report after report, re-emphasizing and reiterating facts that have basically been known for 20 or more years. The academic community have got to step up to solutions and not to reiteration of the problem in ever greater detail. There is a place for that sort of study, but increasingly we have to recognize that there is an urgency of this problem, not just in terms of climate change, but in terms of the rising demographics of the population and the necessity to deliver something such that Jonathan Porritt's world of 2050 is genuinely something that is on the agenda. And this focus on solutions as much as on reiteration of problems is something that I will certainly hold my community of academics as being at times obsessed with ever greater minutiae. Frankly, whether sea levels rise between 50 centimetres or 55 centimetres may be very important for academics in the field. If you are a farmer in Bangladesh, it probably makes damn all difference. You're going to be flooded out. So looking at these areas is really important. Now, if I start, therefore, I'm going to start in the way that when 6 years ago we began to think of what are we going to do about food security. And what could we do as an institution about food security? To understand this, you have to understand Cambridge as a totally bottom-up organisation. If you're Vice-Chancellor, that is the president of this organisation, there is only one authority you do have, is that anything you suggest will never be followed by the academic community. So you have to get a consensus of cats. And believe me, to get that consensus is really important. So we took a leaf out of the mathematicians' books and decided the first thing we would do is to write a series of assumptions. That is what we believed the literature was already telling us, and we did not need to re-examine because we're just going to accept that that is the status quo and the baseline from which we're going to work. So world population estimated to reach 9 billion by 2050? Absolutely. World's current food production is enough to feed the entire population 1.5 times. True. And yet 1 in 8 people suffer from chronic malnutrition. Those, to us, are unassailable facts. 800 million people go hungry, 2 billion people have diets that are lacking more minerals or vitamins, 1.9 billion people are overweight and obese, and that number is growing. And 44% of countries experience serious levels simultaneously of obesity and undernutrition, which has more to do with equity and equality and poverty in communities than it has to do with nutrition. But those are facts. We do not need to re-examine them or study them all over again. Here's the one that really gets to me. 1/3 of the food produced in the world never makes it to the table. More food is wasted per year in the developed world than is produced in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa for the same period. That can be contended, that particular fact, but we decided we would accept it as an assumption in the direction that we wish to take. And I'm afraid we agree entirely that the Western diet is completely unsustainable. You know, the bottom line is feeding one Western adult for a year requires an extra hectare of land and generates 16.6 additional metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So whatever we do, we have to look at that movement towards the Western diet as something that really cannot be sustained. And food security and climate change is not something, frankly, for us that needs debating. It generates, we believe, on average, about 20% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, so it must play a central role in curbing them, and therefore everything we would espouse to do or to contribute to has got to take that as a central theme. But also the climate change will have a disproportionate effect on smallholder farmers and their crops. So we've now got to think about things as to how you're going to do that in the context of the temperature rises even of 1.5 degrees, if we're lucky enough to achieve that. I'm afraid, Jonathan, I'm a bit of a pessimist. I think we'd be lucky with 2 degrees, but that's an issue, whatever governments may say. But we have to plan for that, because the smallholder and the farmer is going to need to be able to deal with it. And pledges have to go hand in hand with a political commitment to overhauling of farming and food systems, not just individual component parts, but the whole system to cope with this warmer world. And that, again, is in from the State of Food and Agriculture from the FAO. But there is another nexus that we often forget in this discussion, and this comes to the forefront, particularly when you begin to start looking at the lowest units of economic viability, particularly in developing countries where agriculture still forms the backbone of the activities. Analysis, certainly within DFID, is that if we have the continued move to urbanization, we're going to need to increase productivity from a smaller population base in those developing countries to be able to sustain the urban populations of the future. And that's going to cause problems. The big issue is that within a village community or within, in the parts of the world that I was privileged enough to work in West Africa, at an individual compound, the trade-offs that occur sociologically in those family groupings are between your capacity to produce food. If you're underproducing, you will have all of the problems of ill health and elsewhere that will happen. If you are ill, you will actually take your kids out of education in order to maintain productivity. So you have this interdependent triangle at the lowest level between health, education, and food. Therefore, they're inextricably linked. And therefore, for governments to think of these as detached systems by putting them in separate ministries does not do much for that lowest economic grouping that we actually have to look at, and particularly the ability to maintain social coherence in those groups. What does that mean to us? That means to us that those disciplines which study societies and study the microeconomics at individual unit level are equally important to those who might be involved in plant breeding or plant sciences if you're going to get holistic answers to this system. So that leads us to the challenge that we set ourselves. And I suppose only a university with, some may say, the arrogance of Cambridge would actually set itself a challenge like that. How do you ensure that everyone in the world has access to enough food for an healthy life on an ongoing basis? It's a big statement to make, and of course we realize we can only provide a component part. But it raised the question to us, why should we bother at all as a university to make that investment, to make this a strategic goal, one of the 10 major strategic goals we have in our university? Should we just say, well, let's leave it to others? After all, we disinvested 20 years ago. Why should we rethink that particular position? And so that led to the question of why universities? What is it that we've got to offer in all of this that maybe institutes can't do, think tanks can't do, major multinational operations? Do we actually have a nexus in this, or should we just bow out and allow the system to take place? Our thinking led to 3 major conclusions and the decision as to why we would get involved. As universities, we have immense convening power. It's actually bigger and better and more trusted than either industry, and certainly much more trusted than politicians. So our ability to be able to pull together academics from different disciplines, alongside politicians and others, under the umbrella of autonomous institutions that don't have a financial nexus in this game, do not have a democratic nexus that we need to be elected, either because we make outrageous statements, as we're hearing in the United States, or that we make statements which are political overtly, are things that actually, I think, the wider public value. And it allows us to start framing the formulation of hypothesis and question in an open way, which we're finding that is being really picked up and found to be of value, particularly with the commercial sector. So this legitimacy, and particularly the capacity that we are focused on serving a global society as major research universities, whether they're in the United States or elsewhere in the world, that commitment towards a global society, I think, does give us that convening power. Now, the second is that research universities have the means and the legitimacy to bridge the gaps between disciplines, sectors of society and cultures. How many of you have heard reference to C.P. Snow's book, The Two Cultures? It's a brilliant set of lectures, always referred to by the media. And here is a great example that you read what you want to. Those of you who've actually read the book will understand that C.P. Snow's fundamental tenet was that there was only one culture, which was an academic culture between the arts, the humanities, and the sciences. If you read any newspaper, clearly the journalist has never gone beyond the title page, which was an editor's area, and uses the title to promote the idea that there's a separation between the arts, humanities, and the sciences. Well, if there is a separation, then my statement is the last place where you will be able to bridge between the social sciences and the capacity of basic researchers, people like myself who might spend their lives with a few molecules, it's actually the university. An institute can't do it because you don't have the bandwidth to be able to do it. Governments certainly can't do it. Think tanks can't do it because you have an a priori set of assumptions. And commercial companies, even if they do it, they won't necessarily be trusted by the wider population to have done so independently. If you lost research-based universities, frankly, there is nowhere where these two disciplines will be able to come together. And if you believe what I've said to you about the microeconomic capacity of delivery at the level of farms in the developing world, where is that going to be studied? And where are we going to study whether the advances that can be made and solutions that can be proposed will be socially acceptable to the very people you're proposing them? And that is a very important component part of why we believed that there was something to be done here. And the last comment is very much the short-term nature of goals. Now, by my own reckoning, my research has been in cervical cancer, and particularly the development of cervical cancer vaccines. We knew what caused cervical cancer. It's actually a single virus. It's there in 99% of all cervical cancers. The association is stronger than that between smoking and lung cancer. It's taken us a long time to figure out how to do it. We will have got good surrogate measures to suggest that immunity will protect. But the net outcome measure, the measure that really matters, have we reduced mortality from this disease, particularly in developing countries? I will never live to see the day of that outcome. I can tell you that now. Well, maybe just, but I'll probably be senile by then, so I won't know what the answer was. The truth is you can do the calculations now that even if you introduced it on a global scale, it would take 35 years before you had that real impact. What I have got my two daughters to promise me, by the way, is to, whatever stone they put above my head at that time, is to put the p-value on the back of it, because I want some archaeologists to struggle over what that hieroglyphic meant. But that anecdote is meant to illustrate where universities are. We're not subject to the political whims of 4-year or 5-year cycles of democracy. We're not subject to the shareholders actually holding us to account at quarterly meetings and being able to promote those areas. We can take a long-term perspective, and that long-term perspective was something that we had, which was unique in this sector, that could actually be brought to bear. So now you come to what I would call the Vice-Chancellors Dilemma. Yeah, great idea, Boris, wonderful, we're all buying into this. How are you going to do this? Because when you start adding up the bills as to how to do this, they become extraordinarily large. So we started, first of all, from the bottom up by making sure that we involved all of our individuals who are interested in this, whatever their discipline, to come together and provided a place where they could begin to start thinking and developing what a strategic direction would be. Now here you've got another peculiarity of Cambridge. We don't do strategy. Or rather, we do strategy, we just don't publish it. The reason being that we believe strategy changes all the time, and the moment you publish a strategy, somebody's going to say, but you said X and Y, and we don't believe that that is particularly constructive. And we began through that to promote the interaction and knowledge sharing, and to begin to establish collaborative programs between engineers, for example, and plant scientists, between the medics working in our metabolic diseases area and those interested in micronutrients. That same group also interested in how do you begin to change trapping genes, for example, in individual plants to be able to improve nutrition. But it began to provide a focus for the university's engagement and stakeholders across business and policy to move forward. And within the university, we finally got them to come down and to make a global statement of vision. Fine, okay, we all do that. But actually, what it came down to was a much more simplified question, is what does an ideal food system, taking into account the assumptions we've already agreed, begin to look like? And how can we contribute in the thinking to develop that system? And in essence, this is a motherhood and apple pie statement, which basically tries to incorporate every individual that is actually engaged in this area. It has to be sustainable and fit for purpose of production. It has to be resilient and efficient with its processing and distribution and supply, which particularly involves the private sector and the real engagement. But it has to be ethical, and it has to be a healthy consumption that is sustainable. And that's why we believed it also required the triangle of business, policy, and civil society to engage in this, because the consequences, even in terms of climate change, if we don't do anything, are really very, very significant. And that then led to the ultimate Vice-Chancellors Dilemma. What do you do about it? Well, the first thing it meant was relatively large-scale investment for us as an institution. And it meant putting this right at the forefront of the ideas that the university was going to pursue. But of course, in a typical bottom-up university, you daren't leave anybody out of the process. So we broke it down into these 8 sectors and then began to put investment in those areas where people were going to convene and interact in those sectors, not merely in those silos for those silos' sake. So, for example, in infectious diseases, we really wanted to get into the control of plant diseases, utilizing David Bolcom's technique of RNA silencing in plant cells. So we recruited people into that particular area. And particularly around poultry, we wanted to get to influenza-resistant strains. So again, you can begin to see you're now encouraging infectious diseases experts, you're encouraging plant biologists, you're encouraging veterinary scientists, and you're encouraging people who understand those systems. Thankfully, they had much of the infrastructure that was required. Unfortunately, the second was not quite so straightforward. And here we were helped by the building of the plant sciences laboratory within Cambridge. We put 100 million sterling into the development of this area to ensure that we can begin to understand hybrid vigor, to understand plant development, to look at photosynthesis and to be able to break that down. But also to understand, how do you dwarf plants? How do you begin to get multiple cropping on single cropping plants? Can you begin to be able to modify, for example, a root crop with its difficulties in harvesting to actually move it to stem or leaf production? Can we begin to change the way in which plants behave at a very fundamental level? And that has brought plant biology right back from the doldrums to right up to the forefront of the School of Biological Sciences. Coupled with this, we did something unusual. We resurrected the Regius Chair of Botany. The last botanist who held that chair was in 1832, who was actually teaching Darwin on walks through the botanical gardens. But we resurrected the chair because we wanted to highlight it to the academic community that this was the future, not the past. The next area was biodiversity and food landscapes. As we've heard, the importance of biodiversity already. So what do? So thankfully, we were able again to raise a complete new building, but to do it in a different way. We just opened a £60 million building called the David Attenborough Centre in Cambridge, which focuses on the issues of biodiversity led by academics. But it's unusual. In the very same building, we've invited 7 major NGOs to actually participate with the academics. They have their offices within that building and engage with academics to be able to understand where that nexus is between those who are both activists and engaged in their particular field, be it the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, right through to those involved in tropical rainforest protection, so that we actually try to end up having that dialogue with those who understand that dialogue to really begin to engage with us. Perhaps the most difficult, oddly enough, was in that corner, because to convince the sociologists and those in political sciences that they had a real part of this game was very difficult. But again, by the creation of a few posts, we were able to encourage them to make appointments into this area, to be able to start looking at microeconomic worlds at individual unit level that would interface particularly with the protection of biodiversity. And at the same time, to give them this major challenge of looking at regulation, which in so many developing countries prevents export of perfectly edible crops, because our regulatory frameworks are just too difficult for them to not achieve, but to prove that they've achieved the huge costs that are actually involved for village farm workers. And that, at the same time, has got our basic scientists very interested in the concept of doing research such that the regulations that are in place are founded on evidence, not on anecdote and supposition. And that is a real problem. The next was to get our engineers involved. And the interests here are, if you want to know about supply chains, ask a damn good engineer. Don't ask a biologist. they've been working on this system for years and years in the construction and other industries. So we got our Institute of Manufacturing to turn over some of its activities to really focus on food supply chains. And that meant that the mathematicians then came on board and began to see this as a very fruitful area for research. And the nutrition area, particularly coming from our clinical school and elsewhere, suddenly began to see that far from this being a dead science, it's actually much more interesting, and therefore they now want to engage with the other elements. And that was, if you like, the last piece in the academic jigsaw. The good news is all that was manageable is in place and is working today. And not any of it has been achieved by diktat, but merely by getting people to understand the scale and the urgency of the problem that we face. Now, as a country, great. The investment, even from governments in developed countries towards this problem for academics, is pretty pathetic, is about the only way to describe it. We tinker with it. It will get a few crumbs off the research table when they come off. We will also see the major research council will support particular ideas. But if you believe that this is responsible for 20% of carbon gases, and you've committed as a government to do something about it, and you've got all these extra mouths to feed, you would think it would be given central urgency on a far greater scale than is the case. Well, I'm always grateful for crumbs, and we can often turn crumbs into cakes, and we will continue to try to do so. But we clearly need to do rather more than was possible. And the good news that we were able to get Europe-wide knowledge innovation communities is, of course, great for Europe, not so good for Britain in the current situation, because having been driving it, we may now find ourselves outside it. But within that community that I've already described, to foster the interdisciplinarity, the most important thing was to begin to develop early career researchers and then to expand our partnerships from looking internally and at ourselves to looking externally, both to our region, to national incentives and internationally. Now, those of you who do not know the United Kingdom, agriculture in the east of England is the fourth largest employer after local government, the NHS and the university. We do not have industries as in many other areas. And it is more or less the breadbasket that feeds much of the United Kingdom in terms of arable crops. So that helped us in this domain because it meant that the localism actually made very clear that this was of regional importance. That community building was being pushed forward by debates which focused particularly on influencing policy, and a flagship project which we've established and is now up and running, a crop science centre, where we now begin to try to take all of those basic disciplines and convert them into an area where they can feed into modern agricultural techniques to improve yield, but also to understand what individual farming communities may need. But the partnerships agenda is the one that I think universities have to work at harder. There are funding sources available, even in the United Kingdom or internationally, for helping the development of partnerships. These are just ones that we're already involved in. But it does mean to pull together the variety of partners that are necessary is not as straightforward. We've been lucky. The first thing that we did was to pick up on the conservation initiative to make sure that we had our conservationists aligned with our plant scientists to talk about land sharing against land sparing, particularly this issue that we cannot keep on utilizing new land. And that is something that really brought those two agencies together. But the next is a regional type of politics that vice-chancellors and heads of institutes will easily recognize. In East Anglia, we happen to have Cambridge. We had UEA with its plant pathology laboratories. We have the John Innes Centre. We have the major BBSRC centres at Rothamsted, as well as a major, vibrant agri-tech sector. And we were able to stimulate and create a cluster partnership covering the whole of the East Anglian region to ensure that those interactions could begin to work. And then taking those initiatives further forward, we've now got an innovation community involving Munich, Reading, Zurich, Belfast, but also commercial partners who really engage in this, who are really very major food producers, so that we can begin to look at that knowledge innovation community. As I said, our biggest problem is whether we will still be part of that knowledge innovation community as things progress. But in other words, stop looking internally, start looking externally, and start developing those partners is absolutely vital. And those consortia have now led to some quite interesting areas where not only have you got to be able to develop those long-term studies that I've been talking about, you've got to have short-term deliverables. Because in the agri-tech sector, for example, we need to be able to deliver predictive tools to local farmers, see how they will work, but then can we actually take them to the developing country community. And one of these is a particular model using water, land, and energy use that we've been looking at, but actually targeting this at individual units of production to see whether we can prefer advice over and above which is independent, for instance, from seed companies that may have, again, a particular axe to grind to use their particular seed stock or not. So that is being used. And this, coupled through the Crop Sciences Centre, will give you an idea of now exactly how international this has become. Now, this has not taken forever. It's taken a good deal of push, it's taken a good deal of shove, but we're there in 5 years. And believe me, if you can do that in Cambridge in 5 years, many other institutions can work even faster towards those goals. So, by being able to do that, we now have a series of activities which engage both the commercial sector and ourselves, and we're really able to take on board major collaborations, which is great for the academics, but we believe it's also great because of that focus on solutions to the problems that we have. So, in that awful world of academia that we have in Britain, impact. So when we have to write the statement, all I'm going to say on the forms is we're helping to feed the world. And enabling the university to engage at international levels is really important. Because the solutions we may find in East Anglia are in the main irrelevant for the communities in India. So we've already established the bridges and have the Indian federal government supporting an institute alongside the Agricultural University of the Punjab, where they are building a centre which will enable our scientists to engage fully in India. And we've created 5 lectureships which will enable those individuals to actually work in country alongside agricultural scientists that are actually well aware of the local problems and to look at the adaptability of the science that's going on into the local solutions. And we're not turning our back on cash crops because we're seeing different problems now in the Punjab to the problems that we might have predicted. Water table loss is fantastically a huge problem for the Punjab. The desertification of what's going on downstream because of the water taken out in the Punjab is really huge. Yet you cannot stop the productivity of the Punjab. Most farmers there are operating on 2 crops, wheat and then rice. Now, if you want 2 more heavy water-using crops, name them, because I can't. Could we actually get them to be more water-sparing? The biggest problem they've got is the concentration of pesticides and insecticides in adult breast milk is well over in acceptable international standards. A long-term health problem that's looking there, but does mean that they have to start looking seriously at nitrogen use and how they are best able to deal with this. Again, solutions for that will not be found in Cambridge, but they may well be found if we can collaborate closely with the scientists on the ground who understand those conditions, but most importantly, have a trial base of 5,000 farmers who are prepared to work with us in that community to try new things, because we're protecting their fundamental income streams in allowing us to use their farms on an experimental basis. So all of this pulls us together and gives us the potential impact. But the real issue for me is then to think about where I wanted to start, which is the interface between industry and academia. And we can't operate any longer within the confines of research grant responsive mode to tackle grand challenges. And as I've shown you on that rather esoteric slide, or motherhood and apple pie slide, business has got to be a key component part. We need to understand where business is coming from, how it is trying to form those solutions, and can we provide an academic underpinning guidance and advice that they may wish to consider in their own business planning processes. So rather than not engage with them, we will engage, but on the terms that a university always engages, that anyone in the university is openly able to criticize, if they so wish, the partner that we engage in. And that's an interesting dimension, and you therefore need those in industry to be big enough and strong enough to recognize that criticism will come. Better that your friends are criticizing you than those who are actually outwardly there to destroy what's trying to be achieved. So we believe that the multinationals, now recognizing the risk of climate change and supply chain stability, are going to seek novel solutions to this. We believe we now have the tools and the expertise to be able to do that. And it's essential that if universities can develop collaborations with the food supply industry, Food Standards Agency, then we have just a chance we can make an impact on this 20% on carbon reduction, but also possibly more important, I'm afraid, Johnson, is whether we're going to be able to feed 9 billion people effectively and to make sure that their nutritional needs are well met, but they're also met with a diet that is varied, interesting, and makes food still a big part of their agenda, or as my waistline would attest, I can enjoy the diversity of food that the rest of the planet provides. Thank you.